Jewish Channel's Week in Review, what critics are calling an international blood libel against Israel. The mayor of the West Bank settlement of Itamar speaks out about the murder of 5 family members there, and what's changing in the world of Israeli business. It's the Jewish news that's changing your world right now on this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. It's an explosive allegation that critics are calling the biggest blood libel in Jewish history. The historic Goldstone report on human rights concerns during the Gaza War of 2008 and 2009 has been in part retracted by the lead investigator and author, Judge Richard Goldstone. Goldstone is a Jewish South African. Goldstone's 575-page report, released in late 2009, contained many allegations against both Hamas and the Israel Defense Forces, but became especially well known for its claims of the intentional slaughter of civilians by the IDF. It has been the source of much discord across the globe and within the Jewish community. Goldstone, in a Washington Post op-ed, has retracted that key claim, saying, quote, "If I had known then what I know now, the Goldstone report would have been a different document." His article states, "Our report found evidence of potential war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity by both Israel and Hamas. That the crimes allegedly committed by Hamas were intentional goes without saying. Its rockets were purposefully and indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets." But Israel's situation was different, Goldstone is now claiming. His op-ed continues, stating that for Israel, quote, "civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy." Goldstone bases that claim about Israeli policy on subsequent investigations in which individual incidents of civilian deaths were found to have been the result of individual soldiers' errors. Goldstone provides one key example, saying, "The most serious attack the Goldstone report focused on was the killing of some 29 members of the al-Simouni family in their home. The shelling of the home was apparently the consequence of an Israeli commander's erroneous interpretation of a drone image." Obviously, Goldstone's partial retraction of some of the bolder claims about Israel in his report have set off large amounts of criticism and debate across the Jewish world. It's hard to summarize a 575-page document into something pat and simple, or to summarize how it was off base, but Goldstone's essential assertion, that the report would have been a, quote, different document, is leading the way. One of the more prominent commentators on Israel, The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg, called Goldstone's op-ed as shocking as it is unexpected, and concluded with the statement, "Unfortunately, it is somewhat difficult to retract a blood libel once it has been broadcast across the world." Given that almost no one who spoke about the Goldstone report actually read its 575 pages, the news articles about the Goldstone report reveal quite a lot. The primary New York Times story on the Goldstone report back in 2009 declared that the report, quote, "reserved its harshest language for Israel's treatment of the civilian Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip." The Times then quoted from the Goldstone report saying, "The report called Israel's military assault on Gaza a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, radically diminish its local economic capacity both to work and to provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependency and vulnerability." The 18 months since the Goldstone report came out have been marked very often by claims of victimization by those on the right and more of the establishment of Israel advocacy, which has been met by claims regarding the report's legitimacy from many of those on the left and various critics of Israel. The Goldstone report made worlds collide, and there was perhaps no better example of this than at the first conference for liberal Israel lobby J Street, held in late 2009. Where establishment dove, Rabbi Eric Yaffe of the Union for Reform Judaism, addressed the Goldstone report to an audience that wasn't interested in his criticism of Goldstone.
And Richard Goldstone should be ashamed of himself. He should be ashamed of himself for working under the auspices of the UN Human Rights Council.
Another example of how the Goldstone report framed the discussion around Israel is the example of Hamas, which initially rejected the report for the same reasons Israel did. It didn't want its actions painted as war crimes. However, Hamas came around on the Goldstone report, seeing how its criticisms of Israel were both original and challenging. So, where does all this discussion of the Goldstone report take us now? Well, it's taking Judge Goldstone himself to Israel. He's heading there in July at the invitation of the Minister of the Interior, in what's seen as something of a defrosting of the attitude of the Israeli government to Goldstone in light of his op-ed. For those who always doubted the Goldstone report, the judge's op-ed is just the latest piece of evidence. But for those who championed Goldstone and the report all along, the main response is to suggest that Goldstone actually hasn't retracted much. Frequent writer on Israel issues M.J. Rosenberg's response is headlined, "Goldstone's edit changes nothing." Because Israel's large-scale military operations in Gaza were bound to produce civilian casualties, so the specific intent of each situation doesn't matter very much. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Goldstone report story is its timing. That the major element used to criticize Israel's human rights record these past few years is being unwound at the same time as regional leaders in the Middle East are strafing their own citizens means that the larger impact of this news is yet to come. We're all waiting to see how Middle East developments in Libya, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and more will affect the perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this reevaluation of the Goldstone report will surely become a factor. Meantime, one of the biggest headlines out of Israel in recent weeks has been that of the murder of 5 members of the Fogel family in the West Bank settlement of Itamar. The mayor of Itamar is now in the midst of a tour of the United States, and Christian Needon caught up with him as he spoke to an audience of hundreds at Yeshiva University.
A full house at Yeshiva University's auditorium last week hosted the mayor of the West Bank settlement of Itamar, Rabbi Moshe Goldsmith, who took questions and gave an update on the aftermath of the Fogel family murders that shook both their small community and the global Jewish community. Goldsmith's wife Leah accompanied him, and she told the crowd about the emotional toll the Fogel's deaths had taken on the rest of Itamar.
The last 2.5 weeks since the terrible night that I'm sure you've all heard about have been a blur. There hasn't been a day, there hasn't been a night. I don't know who I am, I don't know who anyone is. And the first real time I had to sit and have a minute to think was actually here in the United States. Last week, at the last minute, our friends from New York pressured us and said, we know you're very, very busy on Itamar now. Obviously, you have a situation on your hands, but now your voice has to be heard. You're coming.
And for those organizing the trip, Rabbi Goldsmith's audiences have added up.
He has, during this 2 weeks, 49 speaking engagements. I was counting them up. He's given numerous interviews with press. He was on the Glenn Beck show. He had an opportunity to meet with Congresswoman Carolyn McCarthy, where he could potentially influence U.S. policy towards Israel, and she was unbelievably receptive to them.
Even the mayor himself has been surprised at the response.
I had no idea that we'd have such an amazing response of people wanting to hear our story, because again, we're not representing a personal story. We're representing a story of Am Yisrael. And the fact that so many wonderful communities have opened up their arms to want to hear, to listen. What can we do? The calls don't stop coming in.
Goldsmith brought along a visual presentation, but lingered over an image of the slain members of the Fogel family to make a point about the motivation for their murder.
This wasn't a murder like a regular murder. These people, these angels, were targeted because they represent Eretz Yisrael. They don't only represent Eretz Yisrael, they represent every Jew in the entire world. And these 5 souls, these 5 books of the Torah, are radiating throughout the entire world and saying, wake up. Where are you?
To hear the mayor of Itamar give a timeline of the events of that night, please tune into the full broadcast edition of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Christian. One of the longer-term stories about Israel's future is about how well it will continue to adapt in a changing business environment. Rebecca Honig-Friedman stopped by a conference where Israeli startups took center stage.
When it comes to business, there's one thing that Israel is known for.
Innovations.
Cutting-edge innovation.
Hotbed of technology.
A lot of bright ideas.
But turning an innovative idea into a profitable business is a different matter. And to do so, Israeli entrepreneurs are seeking a little help here in the U.S. I'm here at the U.S.-Israel Venture Summit, a matchmaking conference of sorts where Israeli startups come to find American investors. Here, Israeli entrepreneurs have come to present their companies to an audience of American venture capitalists, or VCs, and they hope to find the funding that's much harder to come by in Israel.
In Israel, the funding is very problematic because VCs have practically dried out.
And American VCs are here to get in early on what could be some of the hottest new companies on the market.
There's a lot of very vital, innovative technologies, medical technologies coming out of Israel, so we wouldn't want to miss an opportunity to meet the right company here.
Now in its 5th year, the U.S.-Israel Venture Summit is the brainchild of Joe Benjamin, founder and CEO of Young Startup Ventures, who happens to be an Orthodox Jew.
Obviously, I have a
an interest in helping Israeli companies on a personal level. But even without that, I mean, there's no doubt that investors are taking a serious look at Israel because these are top tier, top quality, cutting edge companies, serious entrepreneurs who know what they're doing, and it makes business sense for these investors to pay attention to these companies.
And some of those investors who've been paying attention were on hand for a panel discussion about the state of venture capital and startups in Israel. As panel moderator Jeffrey Fromm explained, native Israeli VCs are not currently a reliable source of funding for emerging Israeli companies.
Israeli venture funds themselves, based in Israel, raised no capital in 2010. They do have 1.4 billion that is still available for investment, but of that, again, it's about a 20% figure, 230 million that is targeted for initial investments.
And while things are looking up for Israeli VCs in 2011, some are in doubt about the efficacy of the venture capital model in general. But this VC said Israeli companies are still worth investing in.
The good thing about Israeli-based companies is that because the core technology is so strong, that there is the basis for investing in companies that could really define new categories.
Another panelist offered some insight into why Israeli business culture is so conducive to innovation.
I think a lot of that stems from the fact that Israel was actually sooner to realize that there is value in making sure that the inventor is rewarded for their efforts than even the U.S. was in terms of compensation.
For more from the U.S.-Israel Venture Summit, and for tips on how to get your own venture funded, watch the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Rebecca. Finally, closing with an internal note, this is the 100th newscast here at the Jewish Channel. On behalf of everyone here at the Jewish Channel, I'd like to thank you for watching, and on behalf of myself, I'd like to thank everyone here for doing such a wonderful job every week. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable, IO Optimum Cable Channel 291, Time Warner Cable Channel 528, RCN Channel 268, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and Cox Cable Channel 1. For more information, visit tjctv.com.